Dear friends, I cordially welcome all of you for this exciting series of online webinars on the theme Wider Contextual Biblical Hermeneutics, jointly organized by Ecumenical Christian Center and its collaboration with the Church of South India. Today we are going to have 22nd lecture. This lecture will be delivered by a brilliant scholar and a creative theologian by name Dr. J. Stanley Jones. In fact, he is a radical thinker and a good human being. Dr. J. Stanley Jones serves as an assistant professor of the New Testament studies in one of the topmost theological institutions by name Union Biblical Seminary, Pune in India. Currently, he serves as a dean of the graduate studies at Union Biblical Seminary. He also authored 2 scholarly books, and he had written several articles related with the New Testament studies. Today, Dr. J. Stanley Jones will be presenting a fascinating topic on the theme, Contextual Interpretation of the New Testament. I'm sure Dr. J. Stanley Jones will explore creative thoughts from his brilliant mind, and he will provide a feast for our minds and hearts to illuminate our spiritual and ecumenical journey. Thank you very much, Dr. J. Stanley Jones, for accepting our invitation. It is the greatest honor and blessing to have you with us. I humbly and cordially invite you with immense gratitude to take over this time. Now the screen is yours.
Good evening, friends. Indeed, I'm very happy to be part of this program, and I consider this as a privilege to give this lecture on the contextual interpretation of the New Testament. I take this time to thank the Ecumenical Christian Center (ECC) and the Church of South India (CSI) for this initiative of organizing this wider contextualized biblical hermeneutics series of lectures. I thank all those who are part of organizing this series of lectures. Very specially, I thank Dr. Matthew Chandrakunar, the director of ECC, and Mr. Tangminglun Paipai, the deputy director of ECC, for kindly inviting me to give this lecture. I also thank the moderator of this session, Reverend Sukumar Babu. Thank you, sir, for your kind words of introduction. My sincere thanks also to Dr. Johnson Thomas Kuti, my colleague. We work in the same department, for inviting me to give this lecture. This is the first time I am being part of this seminar, and I thank God for this opportunity. The theme for today's lecture is Contextual Interpretation of the New Testament. What we will be looking today is, first, we'll begin with looking at why there is a need for contextual interpretation and what is contextual interpretation. And then we will briefly look at some of the important contextual methods of interpretation. If time permits, we will quickly look into at least 6-7 contextual methods briefly. And then finally, at the last session, we will look at 2 passages from the Pauline letters to see how Paul has contextualized Jesus' teaching to his audiences through his letters, and what lessons can we learn from Paul in terms of a pattern for contextual interpretation. So this will be the outline of this lecture. I'll try to share my screen. Okay. So we'll begin with looking at the history of interpretation. The word hermeneutics is derived from the Greek verb hermeneo, meaning to translate or to interpret, while the noun hermenia means interpretation or translation. Thus, hermeneutics refers to the art and science of interpretation, especially of written text. Since the New Testament text comes from a culture, time period, and geographical location using images, metaphors, and idioms entirely distinct from that of our own language and cultural context, the meaning of the text may not always be readily apparent to us as we read the text. This calls for the use of reading strategies to recover the meaning of the text. Hence, the proper use of principles of interpretation to discover the meaning of a biblical text with the goal of applying that meaning to a context is what we call as hermeneutics or interpretation. There are plenty of methods available for the student of the New Testament for his or her aid for the study of the text. Broadly, these methods can be arranged into three groupings. Namely, one, the words or meaning behind the text, which usually comes from the historical critical method, the source criticism, form criticism, and reduction criticism, and so on. And the second is the word or meaning of the text, which comes from the literary critical approaches, the narrative criticism, rhetorical criticism, reader response, canonical criticism, and so on. And the third is the words or meaning in front of the text, which comes from the social and anthropological studies and contextual interpretation. So what we will be looking today is this part of the contextual interpretation, the words or the meaning in front of the text, the reader-centered, the reader's context. What we will be looking by the word contextual is the reader's context. Now, we'll look at briefly at the limitations of the historical critical method. With the scientific revolution in the 16th and 17th centuries, there was a move away from ahistorical approaches to the Bible to the historical approach. Ever since then, the historical critical method was considered as the dominant and the standard method of critical biblical exegesis till the 1970s. Historical criticism involves careful historical investigation of the biblical writings in order to set them in the cultural, religious, political, and literary environment of their own times. Here, when we say it is their own times, it is the author's context. The historical critical method starts from the belief that any religious text must be understood in its original context. However, since the 1970s, there has been a growing awareness that historical critical method is not really adequate to interpret a text which is not scientific but religious. So to interpret a religious text using scientific methods actually was counterproductive. So ineffectiveness is mainly due to its inability to arrive at conclusive results, which is caused by too many hypothetical possibilities. That was one of the problems of the historical critical method. There were too many hypothetical possibilities. Although historical criticism is a useful method in answering historical questions, it fails to answer one pertinent question: what does the text mean for us today? Also, several of its presuppositions and methods are not compatible with Asian life and spirituality. I have listed three quotations, one from a feminist, one from a post-colonial, and one from a contextual theologian, where they bring out the limitations of the historical critical method. According to the feminist theologian Monica Fander, women's questions are seldom addressed by historical critical analysis, or else the answers proposed are a stumbling block. The result is that the historical critical method may be and is suspected of serving masculine interest. Or as Sugirtharaja points out that historical critical methods are colonial in nature. He states that the methods are colonial because they would have us believe that they have universal validity and significance. Essentially, they are symbols and products of Western culture. What is colonial is the assumption and claim Western scholars make that their work is universal, comprehensive, and exhaustive. According to George Soros Prabhu, the historical critical method, focusing as it does on the literal or original meaning of a text, treats the text as a static entity with a fixed, unchanging meaning or series of meanings, whereas the text is in fact only one rather arbitrarily delineated component of a continuously ongoing process of interpretation. So for the gospel text itself, the product of the interpretation of a developing and continuously interpreted oral tradition from the standpoint of the evangelist is meant to be further interpreted by successive readers according to their respective situations. It has thus not only a past history, but an openness to the future. And he critiques that the historical critical method refuses to allow this openness to the future. So these limitations of historical critical method gave rise to other approaches and methods of interpretation. Alternative methods were developed to make the biblical interpretation more effective and relevant. And one of them is the literary critical methods, where the world of the text or the world or the meaning of the text. So dissatisfied with the inability of historical approaches to provide a consensus reconstruction of New Testament history, scholarly interest shifted to a literary aspect of the New Testament. It attempts to discover the literary techniques and the skilled use of language in the fashioning of the text. Narrative criticism, reader response criticism, rhetorical, or few among the literary critical approach. Now coming to the contextual methods, that is the words or meaning in front of the text. Well, the historical critical methodologies are focused on an author center behind the text and diachronic approach, and the literary critical methodologies on the other hand concentrated on the text center and synchronic approach. Since the emergence of the liberation theology in the 1970s, the attention of biblical scholars, especially from the third world countries of Latin America, Asia, and Africa, have been turning towards the reader-centered and contextual methodologies. These contextual interpretations emphasize the need for liberation and freedom and interpret the scriptures, taking seriously the liberative actions of God on behalf of the marginalized and the oppressed people. Contextual interpretations emphasize the pluralistic ways of interpreting the Bible that derive from the contextual experience of people from different parts of the world. Interpreters are affected by their own socio-cultural and psychological factors, and these factors influence them to formulate their perspective. So contextual interpretation is taking the context of the reader seriously. For instance, a biblical interpreter from India is affected by certain contemporary problems, such as the suffering of the marginalized and the poor, the socio-economic disparity, the ecological crisis created by industrialization and deforestation, the issues related to multi-religious and multicultural factors, the marginalization of women, Dalits, Adivasis, and tribals, the stratification of the society based on caste, class, the plight of the religious minorities, and we can list so many, so on. In fact, these contextual factors shape the manner of one's interpretation. So contextual interpretation is way of reading the scripture, not only on the basis of faith and tradition, but also on the basis of concrete, culturally conditioned human experience. Cultural interpretation, contextual interpretation as an approach to interpreting the Bible elevates this question above other questions. That is, what does the scripture mean to us and our community? So that is the prime question, the primary question that contextual interpretations ask. Contextual interpretation is highly valued for multiple reasons. It takes the readers and the needs and experience of their community seriously. It goes further than traditional Western approaches in acknowledging the importance of what readers themselves bring to the interpretative process. It values ordinary readers instead of privileging the reading of experts. It is highly practical, focusing not on the biblical past, but on the Bible's current impact. It emphasizes the need of liberation, taking seriously the liberative action of God on behalf of the marginalized and the vulnerable. If you look at some of the common liberation contextual methods, and we'll begin with looking at the liberation hermeneutics. This is not an exhaustive study on these contextual methods. Only briefly we'll be looking at some of the methods. Liberation hermeneutics. Liberation theology has its origins in Latin America in the mid-1950s as a response to centuries of oppression of the underprivileged majority of poor, mostly indigenous residents by the ruling elites, government, society, and even the church. Gustavo Gutierrez, the Roman Catholic theologian, is considered the father of liberation theology. The main principles guiding this approach may be summarized as follows. God has a preferential option for the poor. God takes sides with the oppressed against the oppressors and calls believers today to do the same in working for a more human society on this earth. Liberation hermeneutics gives priority to the contextual problems of the people, especially poverty, rather than rhetorics and theories. It follows that exegesis cannot be neutral, but must take sides on behalf of the poor. It believes that one can discover the authenticity of the interpretation only in a context of solidarity with the oppressed. Liberation hermeneutics was responsible for introducing two hermeneutical categories. One is the hermeneutical circle, and the other is the hermeneutics of suspicion. The hermeneutic of circle, it was introduced by Luis Segundo, who first mooted the idea of a hermeneutical circle. According to him, one first analyzes the everyday reality of the context with all its problems and conflicts. Then one goes to biblical texts to listen to their message, and then one returns to the context, bringing in the newness that the gospel introduces to the situation. So this is what he calls as hermeneutical circle. From the context, going to the text and coming back to the context. And this ongoing process is what he calls as hermeneutical circle. The second is the hermeneutics of suspicion. It seeks to expose the ideological bias in biblical interpretation. When a reader approaches a text, they should be suspicious of previous interpretations, particularly interpretations that are not in order with the kingdom principles of Jesus. They should look for hidden influences that might have shaped it being interpreted in that way. In the context of liberation theology, use of hermeneutic of suspicion might include questioning why the revolutionary potential of Jesus' message has not been made more apparent, and so on. For instance, while the whole time of the Enlightenment, from the time of the Enlightenment, scholars began to think that believing in miracles was incompatible with modern science. It was the liberationist understanding of miracles as documents of hope that provided new perspectives to the study of miracles. The miracles of Jesus are to be seen as a liberative change in the existing situation. For the liberation hermeneutics, it is not the wonder-working element that is important, but the significance of the miracles lies in the fact that they are operative signs of the presence of the kingdom. The actions of Jesus' healings and expelling the impure spirits sign that the strong man is being bound and the powers of darkness are overcome. The miracles emphasize a new order in which the powers of darkness were to be thrown out. This is one example of how liberation hermeneutics has given emphasis to the interpretation of miracles. The advantage of liberation hermeneutics is that it interpreted salvation very holistically and empowered the church's mission to those in the periphery of society. However, liberation theology is criticized for its one-sided interpretation of the Bible by stressing its political element and overemphasis of human activity in the process of liberation. While on the one hand it takes the poor seriously, it reifies the poor and tends to romanticize them. In its overzealous to represent the poor, liberation hermeneutics has ended up as a liberation theology of the poor rather than a theology of liberation by the poor. So these are the criticism against liberation hermeneutics, and these drawbacks gave impetus for other people-centered reading. And we'll look at feminist reading briefly. Feminist interpreters are those from feminist perspectives have exposed patriarchy as the root cause for the subjugation of women and advocate women's experience as an important basis for a feminist reading of the scripture. Though several forms of feminist biblical hermeneutics can be distinguished, all unite around a common theme, women and a common goal, the liberation of women and the acquisition of, on their part, of rights equal to those enjoyed by men. The feminist interpretation of the Bible is rooted in the feminist critical consciousness that men and women are fully human and are equal. This approach by women was undertaken because the Bible was understood as promoting and authenticating the dominance and supremacy of men over women. Most outstanding contribution to feminist interpretation of the New Testament is the works of Elizabeth Fiorenza. And from Asian perspective, we have Musa Dube, Aruna Jnanadasan, Huilan, and others. So feminist interpretation employs the following hermeneutical categories. One is the hermeneutics of experience, second is the hermeneutic of suspicion, and third is the hermeneutics of resistance, and then the hermeneutics of retrieval. The hermeneutics of experience, recognizing that women's experience, perspectives, and experiences had not been included in the articulation of Christian theology. Feminist scholars sought to listen to and explore women's experiences of oppression and liberation. Hermeneutics of experience approaches a text by asking for readers' experience in relation to the text. Thus, one's experiences suggest a certain interpretive approach to the text. The second is the hermeneutics of suspicion. This suggests that one should read the biblical text with suspicion rather than trust. It does not take the text as at face value, but investigates the dominant ideology behind the text. In feminist interpretation, suspicion is aroused by the insight that all biblical texts are articulated in grammatically masculine language. Since the Bible texts are historically conditioned and were produced by patriarchal society, they are patriarchal in character and therefore be approached with suspicion. So this is what hermeneutics of suspicion is. The third is the hermeneutics of resistance. This approach is a deliberate effort to read against the grain of texts, of disciplinary norms, of traditions, of cultures. In other words, resistance reading demonstrates the fundamental openness of text and how meaning cannot be determined absolutely, but is itself resistant to ultimate or final interpretation. This reading is a resisting reading rather than an assenting reader, and by this refusal to assent, it begins the process of exorcising the male mind that has been implanted in women. And the fourth is the hermeneutics of retrieval. Hermeneutics of retrieval tries to recover from the biblical text forms of patriarchal mistranslations and misinterpretations with its aim to reclaim the text as positive to women. It searches and brings forth those forgotten, nameless, neglected stories of women so that their stories may come alive today, and most of all, their contributions and struggles in the community may be known. Overall, it employs deconstruction and reconstruction. Deconstruction, the first three steps are a process of deconstruction, and hermeneutics of retrieval is a process of reconstruction. So feminist exegesis has helped women to play an active role in exegetical research. They have succeeded in detecting the presence, the significance, and the role of women in the Bible. Feminist reading helps to unmask and correct certain commonly accepted interpretations which were biased and sought to justify the male domination of women. Apart from transforming the way we look at the Bible, it also has the power to transform the way we look at ourselves and the way we live in our society. The third is the Dalit hermeneutics. Dalit interpretation came into existence due to the struggles of the marginalized Dalits in a caste-ridden Indian society and church. So these struggles of the Dalits, as they were excluded from the mainstream society and the church, they provoked them to come up with this Dalit hermeneutics. The most objective of Dalit interpretation is the liberation from socio-economic and cultural oppression legitimized by religion in the name of caste. So it is a praxis-oriented hermeneutics geared to empower the Dalits in their freedom for in their ultimate struggle for freedom. And as we know, a major proponent of Dalit theology was A.P. Nirmal. Now, somewhat similar to the feminist reading of the Bible, Dalit in biblical interpretation is also a reader-centered approach that takes the life experience of the Dalits very seriously. Though they largely follow the methodology of liberation theologians, they however critique the liberation theologians who are guided by the class analysis, since it is not adequate unless the cultural aspect, that is the caste aspect, is included. Along with the hermeneutics of suspicion and hermeneutics of resistance, the Dalit interpretation further make use of the hermeneutics of liberative and transformative performance model and hermeneutics of solidarity. Dalit reading articulates the pathos as the epistemological basis and the historical Dalit consciousness as the hermeneutical key in Dalit theologizing. In Dalit hermeneutical endeavor, past and present history of the Dalits become very important. The issue of common ground between the biblical world and the Dalit world is of paramount importance for Dalit interpretation. The struggles of Dalits can easily find certain natural affinity towards the struggles and experience of the marginalized communities of the Bible, as there are certain points of convergence in the matrices of both the biblical and the Dalit worlds. The aim of Dalit theology is to make justice, peace, equality, and liberation a reality. We look at the tribal interpretation. Similarly, similar to Dalit interpretation, the tribal approach reads the Bible from the perspective of the tribal's existential circumstances. The tribal's world view of God-human world relationship, God-human world relationship is taken into consideration in interpretation. Economic, cultural, and political liberation is part of tribal hermeneutics. Tribals affirm that the supreme being created the land and the land belongs to God. And the land is the center and key for understanding the world. But today the land and the natural resources has become commercial entities. The inalienable land has become a mere piece of land to be sold and bought. Hence, tribal hermeneutics may look upon the biblical narratives from the perspective of one who is dispossessed from his or her land and culture. Tribal interpretation helps them to revitalize their tribal culture and identity. Ecological approach. An ecological reading of the Bible focuses on God's care and preservation of the earth and God's entire creation. It affirms God's goodness and emphasizes the human responsibility towards protecting and preserving the creation. Destroying creation means rebellion against the Maker. Stewardship and mutual custodianship are suggested as the basis for ecological hermeneutics. It emphasizes the interdependence between humankind and natural world. Since the ecological problems as we experience today was no concern of the biblical writers, the biblical accounts do not provide a uniform account with regard to human relationship towards nature. Hence, the task of a biblical interpreter today is to pick up imageries, metaphors, and symbols from the biblical text and to develop them so as to provide a basis for the appreciation and care of God's creation as against needless destruction. Such an engagement calls for sensitivity to the context of the biblical text as well as an awareness of our own context. We look at one example briefly. For example, the feeding miracle stories invite readers to friendship and relationship with one another and the nature. The Gospels tell us that the disciples gathered up what food was left over. This occurs after feeding the 5,000 and the 4,000, stating that at the end of the feeding of the 5,000, there was enough fragments of food to fill 12 baskets. And in the feeding of the 4,000, there were 7 baskets. In John's feeding account in 6:12, Jesus orders the disciples to gather up what is left over. This should be read as demonstrating a good ecological sense. He does not allow any food to be wasted, nor does he allow the hillside to be trashed with garbage. Those scraps that might otherwise be trampled underfoot or left on the ground to rot are carefully and purposefully preserved. Jesus' feeding of the crowd also demonstrates that God's recreating activities involve not just human but all creation. In feeding the crowd, Jesus gave thanks for the bread and fish before giving them to his disciples to distribute. In giving thanks, he values God as creator of all that is good. According to character, Jesus attacks the injustice of the sinful imperial system, which ensures that the urban elite are well fed at the expense of the poor. Jesus enacts an alternative system marked by compassion, sufficiency, and shared resources. Doctor's argument is supported by the fact that Matthew places the account of feeding of the 5,000 alongside the description of King Herod's extravagant banquet in Matthew 14. Jesus' action demonstrates God's sovereignty over creation. The health of humans depends on the health of all creation. Therefore, the feeding narratives provide another example of the centrality of creation as belonging to God and Him caring for it. We'll also look at the post-colonial interpretation. Post-colonial interpretation as a critical approach to biblical studies has evolved from a third world context, especially among the nations which were formerly afflicted by the European imperialism. Post-colonial studies has gained currency in literary, cultural, and biblical studies since the publication of Edward Said's critique of Western constructions of the Orient in his book Orientalism. In his book, Said unravels the colonial discourses, conscious or unconscious construction of European as the dominant self and the colonized as others. He further exposes how the Western biblical critics consider the Orient as other, that is an object of knowing or knowledge waiting to be dominated. As a result, biblical critics from the victimized and colonized world challenge the colonial paradigm. They try to demythologize the history of the colonized from the colonial ideologies. Post-colonial interpretation offers space for the once colonized. It is an act of reclamation, redemption, and reaffirmation against the past colonial and current neo-colonizing tendencies, which continue to exert influence even after territorial and political independence has been accomplished. Now, applied to biblical studies, post-colonial criticism hopes to perform the following tasks. One, it performs the task of the scrutiny of biblical documents for their colonial entanglements. The Bible as a collection of documents which came out of various colonial contexts needs to be scrutinized for their colonial entanglements. In doing this, it will revalue the colonial ideology, stigmatization, and negative portrayals embedded in the context, plot, and characterization of the text. The second task of post-colonial criticism is to engage in reconstructive reading of biblical text. Post-colonial reading will reread biblical text from the perspective of post-colonial concerns, such as liberation struggles of the past and present. It will be sensitive to subaltern and feminine elements embedded in the text. It will interact with and reflect on post-colonial circumstances, such as hybridity or multiple identities. The third task of post-colonial criticism is to interrogate colonial interpretations. Here, the aim is to draw attention to the effects of colonization and colonial ideologies on interpretative works, such as commentarial writings, which help to inscribe colonial ideologies and consolidate their colonial presence. So that is the third task of post-colonial, to interrogate colonial interpretation and the critique, the commentaries which were written from colonial perspective. The fourth is the contrapuntal reading. One of the hermeneutical agenda of post-colonialism is to encourage a contrapuntal reading. In this reading, the experiences of the exploiter and the exploiter are studied together. In other words, texts from metropolitan centers and peripheries are studied simultaneously. It means to be aware simultaneously of mainstream scholarship and of other scholarship which the dominant discourse tries to domesticate and speaks and acts against. So these are the four tasks that the post-colonial criticism performs. The characteristics of post-colonial reading can be summarized as follows. Protest voice. Post-colonialism will look for protesting or oppositional voices For example, if you take the parable of the tenants recorded in Book 20, a post-colonial reading of the parable of the tenants will bring to the forefront the response of the crowd saying, God forbid. Usually when we interpret it from the perspective of the masters, we ignore this voice. But when we interpret it from the perspective of the tenants and the people, audience, these oppositional or protesting voices comes to the forefront. Thus, post-colonial criticism brings such marginal elements to the forefront and in the process support the traditional meaning. And it is against romanticizing or idealizing the poor. It is also against blaming the victims. So the third character of post-colonial reading is, unlike the dominant reading, it will not blame the victims. It will direct attention to the social structures and institutions which generate victimhood. And the fourth function is decolonizing the imagination. Since colonization was a highly complex process, sometimes the decolonization lacks a clear focus and target. So it requires not the restoration of historically continuous and allegedly pure pre-colonial heritage, but an imaginative creation of a new form of consciousness and way of life. The last one we will be looking at is the religious or intertextual reading. A religious reading brings to the text a pre-understanding informed by India's rich religious tradition, so as to discover in it resonances missed by the Western exegesis. Intertextual reading, a religious reading which reads one religious text along with another religious text, can be of much help for better understanding and appreciation of the scriptures of other religious traditions. It could act as a catalyst in fostering communal harmony in the context of increasing communal tensions and disharmony. The principal hermeneutical task in this mode of reading is not just to interpret the Bible, but to interpret life with the help of the Bible. It seeks to identify the rich religious traditions which is to be brought into a mutually illuminating relationship with the story of the Bible through a creative act of the dialogical imagination. Some examples of intertextual reading I have listed here. One is George Soros Prabhu. He compares the mission command of Jesus in Matthew 28:16-20 and the mission command in the Buddhist scripture given by Buddha to his first followers as narrated in Mahavagga. Soros Prabhu demonstrates how they are complementary and mutually enriching through a wider intertextuality that links biblical texts with texts from other religious traditions. Both the Christian and the Buddhist mission commands include a summon to teach, whereas in Matthew, the disciples are to teach what Jesus has commanded to them. The Buddha commands his bhikkhus to preach the Dharma. Also, both mission commands aim at the ultimate liberation of humankind. In the Buddhist mission, this aim is quite explicit. The monks are sent out for the profit of many, for the happiness of many, and out of compassion for the world. Both the mission commands are conscious of the universality and plurality of mission, and both the Christian and the Buddhist mission commands ends with a promise. This is one study that George Soros Prabhu has done. Studies have also been done on the theme of discipleship in the Gospels and Guru Shishya relationship in the understanding of Hinduism. And Sambi Matthew has also attempted another study of an intertextual reading of the parable of the sower in Mark's Gospel and the parable of the field in the Buddhist literature. And another intertextual study attempted by Sambi Matthew is the study of wealth in the Gospel of Luke and wealth in Tirukkural, the Tamil literature, Tirukkural. So these are some of the examples of intertextual reading. Now, before we move into looking at the Paul's text from Pauline letters, we'll briefly look at the resources from the Indian context. One is the use of myths, legends, and stories, and second is the resources for background studies. Resources for a contextual reading of the Bible are to be found both in biblical studies and in the resources of indigenous communities. Innumerable indigenous legends, stories, poems, and songs that are part of the varied and rich cultural heritage of India still remain largely unexplored. Now, Puilang notes, Asian Christians are heirs to both the biblical story and to our own story as Asian people, and we are concerned to bring the two in dialogue with one another. Dexter S. Maben, in one of his papers presented in a seminar, attempted to imagine a hermeneutics which revolves around the biblical perspective of the neighbor with resources from the Vachana movement in Karnataka, which originated in the Bhakti tradition. Again, the resources for background studies. Most treatment of the biblical background deals mainly with West Asia, Rome, and Egypt. Historians provide overwhelming evidence to suggest the presence of concepts and ideas from ancient India in the places from where some biblical texts originated and had their influence. Again, Sambi Matthew in a paper, can anything good come out of India for biblical background? In a seminar, he elaborates ancient India's connection with Phoenicia, Babylon, Greece, Egypt, Roman Empire, and concludes that ancient India and its religious traditions has close relations with the biblical world. Now, he concludes that the answer to the question, can anything good come out of India for biblical background, is definitely affirmative. Now, to conclude in the last session, we will look at two passages from the Pauline letters to see how Paul has contextualized the teachings of Jesus in his letters. One is the mission instruction that we find in 1 Corinthians 9, and the second is the love of enemies that we read in Romans chapter 12, verse 17 and 18. So this is Paul's use of Jesus saying a mission instruction. We find that in the Gospels in Luke chapter 10, verse 7 and Matthew 10:10. It is understood to be a Q passage. And then we find Paul borrowing that, alluding to that, or quoting that, saying in his letter to Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 14. In Luke 10:7, text reads, remain in the same house. This is part of the mission instruction given by Jesus to his disciples. Remain in the same house, eating and drinking whatever they provide, for the laborer deserves to be paid. Matthew 10:10, no bag for your journey, or 2 tunics, or sandals, or a staff, for laborers deserve their food. In Corinthians, we find that the same way, the Lord commanded, by Lord, Paul is actually referring to Jesus. The Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. Now, in 1 Corinthians 9:14, Paul refers to this Jesus saying to make a point in his argument that an apostle is worthy to receive support. Since this occurs in the context of defending his apostleship, in chapter 1 Corinthians 9, 1b and to 3, it seems that Paul's failure to take support has been used against him to call his apostolic authenticity into question. So since he was not accepting support, people were questioning his authenticity as a disciple. So in that context, he brings this Jesus teaching in his letter. In the course of the discussion, Paul offers 5 reasons to prove his point that he is entitled to have his living expenses paid for by the Corinthians. Of these 5, it is in the last of these 5 that he appeals to Jesus' teaching, that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. Now, development of Jesus' teaching. How does Paul develop Jesus' teaching? There are 4 things to note about the way Paul cites and employs this saying. 1, in the place of the word laborer, he has substituted the phrase those who proclaim the gospel. Second, Paul conveys Jesus' words to the Corinthians as the Lord decreed. Now he uses the word command. While in Jesus' tradition, it is not a regulation of any kind, but a simple statement for the laborer deserves to be paid. It was a simple statement, but that was converted into a decree, a command in Paul's letter. Third, While in Jesus' tradition, the saying was directed to the disciples who should devote the time and energy for the mission, while others will take care of the needs. In Paul, the saying is directed to the congregation who are to take care of the apostles' need. So, what is said to the disciples is being said to the congregation. Fourth, having cited the Lord's decree, Paul asserts that he has no intention of adhering to it when it comes to the Corinthians. Now he says, but I have made no use of any of these rights, or am I writing this so that they may be applied in my case? So he's actually, even when he calls that as a decree, he says, I am not going to, or it doesn't fit in my case. Now the reason for the development is, why does he develop Jesus' teaching? Paul substitutes the word laborers with those who proclaim the gospel, because the substitute helps him to register the point that Jesus' instruction applies in his own case, no less in the case of Jesus' disciples. Also, this is because Paul has used the traditional word laborer or worker elsewhere in his letters with a negative sense, with reference to evil or deceitful apostles or false apostles or missionaries. So he avoids that term. Also, Paul refuses to adhere to his statement, which he calls a decree, because according to Kuhner, at Corinth, those capable of conferring benefits on Paul were the elite, among whom he had made his first converts. Hence, the gifts were highly personal, and Paul's acceptance would have monopolized his attention to them in a context where the needy poor would have had little chance against the resources of the elite. So this becomes clear if Paul's refusal of Corinthian support is contrasted with accepting material support from other congregations, including support from Philippi twice, once while in Thessalonica and at Corinth. And because the Philippian gift was a communal gift, it was represented as a community effort. It was a collective effort by the community, and so Paul had no problem in accepting the gift, whereas the gift in Corinth was more of personal, and so Paul doesn't want to give a picture of favoritism to anyone or to the elite. So he accepts help or subsidies from other churches, but when it comes to Corinthians, he refuses. Here, Paul takes side to the poor in spite of the pressure to accept support by the elite group. Even while citing a saying to Jesus to substantiate his argument, finally he gives his own conclusion without taking seriously the intention of Jesus. The second example we'll be looking at is the advice to love enemies. In Romans chapter 12, Paul employs a saying from Jesus' tradition about love for enemies from the Sermon on the Mount and Sermon on the Plain. It is also supposed to be a cue source. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Scholars studying the parallels between Jesus and Paul agrees that this is an allusion to Jesus' saying. The intertextuality here is not marked, but it is intended. That means even though Paul is not meaning that it is the words of the Lord, but he is intending. He knows that he is referring to the saying of Jesus. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 44, chapter 5:44, the passage reads, "But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." The same verse in Luke chapter 6 says, "But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you." And Romans 12:14, Paul uses the word, "Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse them." Now, development of Jesus' teaching. When Paul employs this Jesus' teaching, we note three characteristics. At first glance, neither love your enemies nor pray appears in Romans. Paul substitutes love with bless and enemies with persecutors. It seems that Luke regards the two words bless and pray as synonymous, but Paul has chosen the word bless and used it twice, replacing pray with bless. Also, Paul substitutes the positive commandment by negative clauses, which only say what one must not do. Do not curse, and serves as a concrete minimum understanding of love for enemies. Now, the reason for this development is the reason for Paul's choice of the word bless instead of pray may be due to the fact that the term bless is more than just a Jewish religious term or more inclusive term, and bears a strong and ancient Greek cultural background. Also, Paul may be thinking of his Roman Christian addresses who might have identified the recent persecutors as their major enemies. Also, Paul avoids using the word love explicitly because it is clear that the concept of love can be applied within the Christian community, but it is difficult to transfer it to outward relationship. Also, Paul avoids using the word enemies when he refers to external relationship in Romans 12, 9 to 21. If you see Romans 12, he starts with the concept of love in Romans 12, 9. Let love be genuine. And he goes on to speak about love. He refers to love when he's speaking about the internal relationship within the community, but mostly in terms of brotherly love. But once he shifts to external relationship, he avoids mentioning the term love. So the reason that a target must first be identified before Christians can speak of love for enemies. But this would be very sensitive to the Christians in Rome, especially after the expulsion of the Jewish people because of the Claudius edict against the Jews in 49 CE. It would be insensitive to identify the Roman emperor or government directly as enemy of Christian community. So instead of enemy, he uses a word, more de-radicalized word, persecutors. Similarly, Romans 12:18, he says, if it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Again, this is a saying alluded, this is something alluded from Jesus' teaching. Again, from the Sermon on the Mount. And in that context, he is again modifying it to say, if it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. According to J.D. Dunn, the policy Paul advocates here is one of political realism as a safety first policy of avoiding trouble, refusal to retaliate in the face of provocation, and recognition that the civic authorities exercise God-given authority. What lessons we can learn from the concluding remarks? Interpreting the Bible has become more challenging with the increasing diverse ways of reading the text. There is no single method that can be termed as the most appropriate to deal with all the issues. Rather, our approaches must benefit from the many models and their contribution towards making the text relevant. Each method arises in the deficiency of the previous methods, and each brings new meanings from the text. It is possible for a text to have a surplus of meanings, each relevant to a particular context. Hence, in interpreting the Bible, our choice of methods should help us to study the text in a manner which addresses the basic issues arising out of our context. As Soros Prabhu puts it, an Indian exegesis cannot be an exotic plant growing in isolation out of the humid soil of traditional Indian methods of interpretation. Rather, it will result from the cross-fertilization of modern methods of biblical exegesis with contributions from Indian exegetical tradition, coming to flower in the stormy climate of the socio-cultural reality of India today. Thus, Indian biblical hermeneutics is primarily concerned about developing a proper Indian perspective and effectively using resources available from the Indian context, as well as selected critical tools and insights from the history of biblical interpretation for making the biblical message relevant to the Indian people. In a context such as ours, so our interpretation must be an interpretation based on respect to other faiths and culture, an interpretation that is gender just, an interpretation that is love-centric, an interpretation that is cosmocentric, an interpretation with commitment to the poor and the marginalized, an interpretation with the goal of liberation and communal harmony. I'll close with this quotation from Alonso, quite interesting. So I thought I'll put it in there. People ask us for bread, and we offer them a handful of theories about each verse of John 6. They ask questions about God, and we offer them three theories about the literary form of one psalm. A thirst for justice, and we offer the discussions about the role of the word tzedakah. I am examining my conscience out loud, and the reply I hear is, the one must be done without neglecting the other. I think this should be our guiding principle in our interpretation. The one must be done without neglecting the other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. J. Stanley Jones, for your brilliant presentation. Your lecture shows how hardworking you are, how brilliant you are. In fact, your presentation was multidisciplinary on the theme Contextual Interpretation of the New Testament. Thank you for the genesis of your presentation with a question, what is the need of the hour? Contextual methods, 2 passages from Pauline letters. Thank you for unpacking the word hermeneutics from the Hellenistic historiography. Thank you for exploring 3 groups of questions: meaning behind the text, meaning of the text, meaning in front of the text. Thank you so much for explaining historical critical methods. How important to investigate scientifically the depth of scriptures. I'm much delighted to listen to the writings of Monica Fander, R.S. Sugirtharaja, Elizabeth Susler Fiorenza, Aravind P. Nirmal, Sam P. Matthew, Musa Dubey, Aruna Gnanadasan, Dexter S. Maben, W. Carter, Wak Puilon, J.D.G. Dunn, and the list goes on. Thank you for explaining literary critical methods, the contextual methods, from the lens of poor, from the lens of ecological crisis, from the lens of multi-religious and multicultural dimensions, from the lens of women, from the lens of Dalits, from the lens of Adivasis, from the lens of tribals. Thank you for explaining feminist interpretation, Dalit hermeneutics, tribal interpretation, the ecological approach, post-colonial interpretation, religious intertextual reading. You did a fantastic job, Dr. J. Stanley Jones. It is fascinating to listen such a dynamic presentation. In fact, you made a big difference in our minds by your brilliant lecture. You are unique and genius. On behalf of all of us, I sincerely thank you very much for your hard work. Before I give this time to the audience for the questions, let me tell 3 short instructions. As usual, your question should focus on the topic, and your question should be precise, and your question should be inclusive. Now, over to the screen. There is a question from Mary Nancy. Let me read from the public chat. In the intercontextual reading, how could we explain the Christian witness and religious dialogue? Now, after the study, we get to know what it is. How do we explain it to the ordinary people? Dr. Stanley Jones, you can respond.
Thank you for that question. That is actually a struggle. How to explain it to ordinary people is a struggle that everybody goes through. And we should ask for God's guidance, the direction of the Holy Spirit, to convey this in a meaningful way that they will understand in a context as us. They will understand and accept it with respect, and also without hurting their Christian witness. But that is our responsibility also to convey this, because in a multicultural context as we, it is a very important one that to understand the context, the religious text of others. It is more to treat them with respect, treat them with respect, looking for mutual edification. It is not one imposing one on the other, but it is for a mutual edification. I think that is should be our. If it's for mutual edification, then I think it can be done without the conflicts.
Professor Gnanavaram.
Yes, I'm on the same in the same line. I need to comment one thing. Thank you very much, first of all, Dr. Stanley Jones. It was very, very useful, and I appreciate you for the hard work. Only one thing with Mary Nancy, this inter-religious dialogue interpretation, same thing. You know, Dalit theologians or Dalit interpreters normally have difficulty with the dialogical interpretation. As you know, everybody understands it, and there is a difference between the so-called Indian Christian theological approach and the Dalit approach. Why do we differ? All those things, you know that. The present situation of Tamil Nadu, some of you who are aware of the situation in Tamil Nadu may understand that Dr. Thol Thirumavalavan, the leader of Vidudalai Chirutaigal Katchi, has said something about this, how do you call it, Manusmriti. You know, there is a great opposition for him. Manusmriti talks about women oppression. How do you interpret it? How do you respect it actually? This is the situation. We have our own struggle with our biblical texts. We have to agree with that. But how do you respect it without telling the truth actually? Without telling the truth that there are scriptures, Vedas and Manusmritis which are very much oppressive towards women and Dalits. How do you go with that? That's the only thing which I would like to ask you for a comment, for a contribution for your final thing. There is a book by my mentor, Dr. David Wenham. You may know that. Many years ago, he wrote a book, Paul, the follower of Jesus or founder of Christianity. Are you aware of it?
Yes.
Paul, is he a follower of Jesus or a founder of Christianity? That book may be helpful to you for your last part. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the suggestions. Yes, I went through that book. Definitely, it has a lot to say. Yeah. Comparison of Jesus and Paul. So maybe once again I'll have to go through that book again. And when it comes to how to accept this parallel reading of the religious text, when we say intertextual reading, parallel or mutual, it is not, to me, I think it does not include uncritical acceptance.
Yeah.
I think that we should be very careful. It is not to accept anything. Ours should be, it's not to move beyond uncritical acceptance. That will be dangerous. That will be dangerous and oppressive. So we need to be careful in that sense. But to the extent that is possible, to mutually understand and respect, we need to look at.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Stanley Jones.
Now next, Reverend Mehboob. Please unmute and raise your question, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. My question is, you have highlighted the deficiency and the historical critical method. I would like to know your comments on what value it has in today's interpretive practices, and also most of the methods that you have pointed out or highlighted seem to me point to the kind of reader-based interpretation or focused interpretation. If we, adopt any of these or some of these methods, how to avoid the danger of eisegesis, because that remains, I think, to my mind, quite apparent. So I'd like to have your comments on these two.
Okay. The problem with the historical critical method is not that it's not helpful. It is definitely helpful to solve half of the problem. When I say half of the problem, the behind the text, because that is also important for our interpretation. But then it stopped there. It did not move forward, or it did not give space for in front of the text interpretation. It did not give space for the reader-centered interpretation. And that is why, in counter to that, these contextual interpretations came into place. Now, the issue of ICGs is, yes, of course, that is true. That is even true, even historical critical method. Because even historical critical method, there is no one set of truth. No, there is no one possible. There is multiplicities of possibilities. Either we take authorship or date or context, any recipients or anything. Multiplicities of possibilities are put there. So the danger of ICCs is even there. It is not only in the contextual or the reader-centered interpretation. Maybe here the danger is a little more. But then ICGs is also a type of interpretation. That is how I understand it. Because before historical critical method comes into play, for centuries, Christian community was using allegorization, typology, and other sort of interpretations which did not have a historical basis, but as we say, maybe more of an ICGs type of an interpretation. But that was also accepted. That is why there is a common saying that we have moved from allegorization to allegorization. We have first century, the problem was with allegorization. Then we moved to historical methods, literary methods, human science methods, and then back to contextual methods. Some say it is also a sort of allegorization. But then allegorization is also an interpretation because Jesus himself allegorized. Now, if you take the parable of the sower, it is a sort of allegorization. So, but we need to be careful. We need to be careful, and these parameters, these biblical principles, interpretative hermeneutical principles, will guide to avoid such dangers of ICGs, even in contextual or reader-centered interpretation.
Let me read a question from the public chat by John Bollis. Would you please elaborate precisely hermeneutics of suspicion?
Yes, hermeneutic of suspicion is to come up with an attitude of suspicion, not accepting the interpretation at face value, but to question why such an interpretation is given. Because throughout centuries or for many centuries, the interpretation that we are used to, be it commentaries or in today's context of COVID, the online resources that we get. So most of these online resources that we get, the commentaries come from Western interpreters who, to some extent, they were actually molded by these colonial perceptions. So instead of accepting the interpretation as it is, even it be from a prime commentary, the hermeneutics of suspicion gives us an opportunity to first to suspect the interpretation, particularly interpretations that are against the kingdom principles of justice, equality, and justice. So against the kingdom, if an interpretation goes against the kingdom principles, the first duty of an interpreter or as a reader is to suspect it. Why such an interpretation is given? So that is the function of the hermeneutics of suspicion. For example, throughout most of our commentaries read the parable of the tenants, that which I also cited as a small example, from the perspective of the master. and it is always called as the wicked tenants. Now, most of the commentaries call it the parable of the wicked tenants. But then, if you read it from the perspective of the tenants, or the congregation that were there who shouts, God forbid, God excuse or forbid, then we all altogether get a different meaning. That happens with suspicion. If there is no hermeneutics of suspicion, we actually accept the oppressive interpretations, and then there will be no possibilities for us to interpret with liberative values.
Can I a little supplement to this?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. You know, is it only the suspicion on the interpretation or suspecting the text itself? There are people who say that we need to suspect the text itself because the text itself was an interpretation of what happened during Jesus' time. A Matthean interpretation, a Markan interpretation, a Lucan interpretation, and a Johannine interpretation. So, do you suspect only the interpretation of the modern scholars, or do you suspect the text itself?
Yes, hermeneutics of suspicion actually, as used by feminists and as used by other post-colonial, it suspects the text also. It suspects the text because as precisely as it was said, because the text itself is an interpretation. We have the interpretation of what Jesus preached in Aramaic, in the Greek language, in the perspective of the gospel writers. So yes, in their language, it is also suspecting the text. So thank you for bringing that aspect.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Friends, thank you so much for all your questions. I'm sure many of you have questions. Soon we'll ponder and contemplate those questions. On behalf of all of us, I sincerely thank the presenter, Dr. Stanley Jones, for your brilliant presentation. As a sign of respect and immense gratitude, shall we wave both our hands and thank him for his brilliant presentation. Thank you very much, sir. It means a lot. Now I give this time to Professor Dr. Johnson Thomas Kuti, sir, for the announcements. Over to Professor Johnson Thomas Kuti.
So thank you so much for this wonderful occasion that I am very much thankful to Dr. Stanley Jones, my colleague here in UBS, for coming up with a wonderful and erudite presentation. And he was covering a lot of things. All his points are, okay, different papers can be developed as single papers. So in that way, I think that he was bringing a comprehensive or a recapitulative, okay, understanding of all the, okay, what is that called, contextual approaches to the New Testament, especially the biblical text. He covered liberation approach, feminist interpretation, Dalit hermeneutics, tribal interpretation, ecological approaches, post-colonial, religious intertextual reading. And also he was bringing two contextual, okay, interpretations from the Sitsum Lavan Jeshu to the Sitsum Lavan Krishe. That means especially in the Sitsum Lavan Paulus, a Pauline interpretation of the scriptures. And he has given us an excellent theoretical framework about the contextual interpretative, okay, theories, rules, okay, thumbs, and various. Stanley, okay, may God bless you. And with regard to the, you know that we are almost coming close to the graduation, and we have 2 more lectures. So next week we are going to have another erudite presentation about the feminist interpretation of the New Testament. Feminist interpretation of the New Testament by Sister Dr. Prema Vakil. Sister Dr. Prema Vakil. She is going to give us an erudite presentation on feminist interpretation of the New Testament. And afterwards, we have one more presentation. And then we are going, 12th and 19th, we are having two lectures. And 26th, we are going to have our big day. That is the day of graduation. Okay, so this is just an announcement to keep that in mind. Okay, and I see many friends here. Dr. Jnanavaram is always our supporter, and he's always coming and giving us encouragement. And also I see some of the friends from Ghana, is present here. And that means we have even African presence here. Okay, that is something noticeable. And with regard to the assignment next week, all are supposed to write an assignment within 300 words. Okay, as we have studied all the theories, now we are coming to the exegesis. So when we do exegesis, today Dr. Stanley Jones was continually referring John chapter 6 verses 1 to 15, feeding the 5,000. So in that case, the exegesis is read John chapter 6, 1 to 15, by taking into consideration the theories that are explained today. Okay, that means the liberation, feminist, Dalit, tribal, ecological, post-colonial, and religious. That is impossible. Okay, we are just checking how you are able to identify some of the aspects within 300 words. So you cannot do justice, we know that. Okay, even when we evaluate, we cannot do justice. But we are trying to give you a chance how you are able to identify some of the things based on the theories. It is not necessary to make use of all the theories. Even you can make use of maybe feminist or ecological or Dalit or tribal, post-colonial, or even some others. Okay, for example, persecution, poor and poverty, and various other concerns you can incorporate alongside of that. So that is the way how you are reading John chapter 6, 1 to 15. That is what we are looking into that assignment. So in that way, it is more a kind of exegetical, or hermeneutical assignment. Thank you so much. May God bless us. Over to Reverend Sukumar.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the announcements. Friends, once again, I sincerely thank the presenter, Dr. Stanley Jones, and the mastermind behind this series of webinars, our director, Professor Father Matthew Chandran Kunil, and the brilliant mastermind and architect, Professor Johnson Thomas Kuti, for your kind help. Thank you very much indeed, and have a blessed evening.